There is a kind of man who has learned to live on very little, not because he has to, because needing things became too expensive. I did not open my bakery because I had nothing better to do with my mornings. I opened it because 4:30 in the morning was the only hour the city left me alone, and I had learned by then that loneliness was only miserable when it was forced on you. Chosen, it was something else entirely. It was the hour before anyone needed anything from me, before other people's expectations settled on to the day, like weather you could not stop but had to move through anyway. In those early hours before the first customer pushed through my door, I was only myself. Hands in dough, oven heat on my face, the particular silence of a kitchen that knows its job. I called the place Holloway's. No clever branding. No mood board aesthetic designed to make people feel like eating toast was a spiritual experience. Just a small converted storefront in Greenpoint with exposed brick I had painted white myself, 6 counter stools, 2 small tables, and a chalkboard menu that changed based on what I felt like making and what the market had that week. Sourdough, soft eggs, steel-cut oatmeal with real maple syrup and sea salt, coffee I ground myself because the pre-ground kind tasted like giving up. My regulars came before 6, Danny the electrician, who always ordered the same thing and never once tried to make small talk before his second cup, a rotating cast of night shift nurses from the hospital 4 blocks over, who ate like they were refueling equipment, efficient, grateful, usually half asleep. Old Mr. Petrakis from the dry cleaner next door, who called me the bread girl even though I had told him my name 40 times, and who I liked too much to correct anymore. What I had built was small, I knew that, but small did not mean less than. It meant exactly what it was, and that had always been enough for me. The day Weston Ford first walked through my door, I almost turned him away. Not because of who he was. I did not know that yet. I almost turned him away because it was 5:40. On a Tuesday in November, my counter was full and 2 nurses were waiting on eggs. I had no patience left for someone who looked like he had never once waited in line for anything in his life. He stood at the door with 2 men flanking him at a distance too precise to be casual, and he had the kind of stillness that told you immediately. This was a person the room would rearrange itself around whether it wanted to or not. I did not rearrange. I pointed at the one empty stool at the far end of the counter and told him 20 minutes. He sat without argument. That was the first thing that caught me. Men who moved with that much quiet authority almost never sat without argument. He was tall, early 40s, dark overcoat that cost more than my monthly rent. His face was angular and carefully composed in the way of a man who had learned very young that expression was information and information was leverage. His hands were flat on the counter, both of them, not reaching for his phone, not fidgeting, just still. One of his men leaned in and said something. Weston turned his head a fraction of an inch and the man stepped back. When the counter cleared, I slid down and asked what I could get him. Coffee, he said. His voice was the kind of low that did not need to go louder to carry. I brought it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they want to want and cannot make themselves want. Then he wrapped both hands around the mug, held it for a moment, and set it down without drinking. The nurses got their eggs and left. Mr. Petrakis came and went. The counter emptied out by 6:15, and he was still sitting there with untouched coffee and a face I could not read. I refilled his cup without asking. He looked up at that. "You didn't ask," he said. "I can tell when a cup needs filling," I said. "I can also tell when someone isn't going to drink it either way." Something moved behind his eyes, not offense, more like surprise that had decided to stay quiet and see where things went. I asked if he was actually hungry, or just waiting for his people to finish whatever they were doing outside. He was quiet one beat too long before he answered. "I don't eat in the morning," he said. "My grandmother taught me to cook in a kitchen the size of a closet in South Philly, and what she taught me was not technique. Technique came later, from cookbooks and trial and catastrophic error. What she taught me first was to watch, to notice what a person actually needed versus what they said they needed. She said food was a language, and most people were illiterate in it, and if I was going to spend my life in kitchens, my job was to translate. I looked at Weston Ford and translated. His color was wrong, not sick exactly, but wrong in the specific way of someone whose body has been running on too little for too long and has stopped sending distress signals because it has learned no one is listening. The muscle along his jaw was tight. The hand nearest me had curled a little, even though the rest of him was perfectly still. I turned back to the stove before he could figure out I had been cataloging him. "You don't have to eat anything," I said, "but I'm putting a bowl of oatmeal at the end of the counter in 5 minutes. If it's there when you leave, I'll assume you don't want it." He didn't say anything. I made the oatmeal, steel cut, cooked slow, a spoon of good maple syrup and a pinch of sea salt and nothing else, because simple things have a better survival rate than complicated ones. I set it at the far end of the counter and moved to the other end to wipe down surfaces. 3 minutes later, I heard the sound of a spoon. I did not look up. People eat better when they don't feel watched. When he left, the bowl was empty. He said exact change on the counter, $12.50 for coffee and oatmeal, and walked out without a word. His men folded in around him, and the car pulled away, and the morning went back to being ordinary. The flower seller from the market stall across the street knocked on my open door at 6:30 and told me she had seen the cars and did I know whose they were. I said no, she told me. Weston Ford, construction, real estate, half the new development contracts in Lower Manhattan, and the kind of legal record that lawyers made careers staying ahead of. The kind of man the city needed and feared in equal measure, which is the only kind it ever really respected. I cleaned the counter where he had sat and told myself it was just a bowl of oatmeal and a strange morning. He came back the next day, and the one after that. By the 4th morning, I stopped pretending to be surprised and started making the oatmeal before he sat down. He stopped pretending he wasn't coming back and started sitting at the far end of the counter like it was his. We talked in pieces. He asked questions like a man taking inventory, not personal, not warm, but specific. Where did I source the grain? Why steel cut instead of rolled? How long I had been in Greenpoint? I answered without asking why he wanted to know, because some people need information to feel safe around something new, and the need was not a flaw. It was just the shape of how they moved through the world. On the 6th morning, he drank the coffee. On the 9th, I asked why he didn't eat elsewhere. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I stopped being able to eat regular food about 2 years ago." I waited. He looked at the bowl in front of him. His hands were around it the same way they had been around that first coffee mug. Not eating, just holding, like the warmth was the point. "Not physically," he said. "The doctors all say there's nothing wrong with me." A pause. "My brother died at dinner." The sentence was so flat and complete that it took me a moment to understand it wasn't a metaphor. He told me the rest without looking up. His brother, younger by 6 years, a restaurant in the West Village, a Tuesday night, a reservation that Weston himself had made, and then not shown up to, because a deal had gone sideways and he sent his car instead and said he would be there within the hour. He was not there in an hour. By the time he arrived, his brother had been gone 40 minutes, from something in the wine that had been meant for both of them. Weston had lived because he was late. He had been late because he chose work over dinner, the same way he had chosen work over dinner 100 times before. And the last time he did it, it kept him alive and killed the only person in the world who had never once asked him to be different than he was. 2 years later, his hands still shook when someone else set food in front of him, his body still locked up at the smell of restaurant kitchens. He had seen 4 specialists. He managed meal replacement drinks, protein bars, things sealed and controlled, and requiring no one's hands, no one's intentions. But real food, food with someone's choices baked into every ingredient, his body had learned to treat that like danger. Until my oatmeal. He did not say the last part, but it was in the room between us anyway, and we both knew it. I asked what his brother's name had been. "Will," he said, and then he picked up his spoon and finished the bowl, and I went to the other end of the counter and let him have that in peace. I should have been sensible after that. He was a man with enemies organized enough to poison a restaurant's wine, with a life that moved in black cars and closed-door meetings. I was a woman with sourdough starter in my refrigerator and flour under my fingernails, and a lease coming up for renewal in March. But sensible and right are not always the same thing. By the third week, he was staying past 7, sitting at the end of my counter while I prepped lunch specials, both hands around a second cup of coffee. We talked more. He told me about the development projects, the ones that frustrated him, the ones he was quietly proud of. I told him about the restaurant jobs I had left, 3 of them in 4 years. 1 head chef who presented my recipes under his own name, 1 general manager who thought a hand on my lower back was part of the compensation package. Weston's jaw tightened at that last part. I told him the man's name was unimportant and the restaurant had closed 2 years later anyway, which was satisfying enough. He laughed, just once quiet, like it had gotten out before he decided whether to let it. I hated how much better it made the room feel. The first sign of trouble came 11 days later. A health department citation left in my door at 7 in the morning while I was still inside. Improper ventilation, storage violations, pest evidence near the rear entrance. None of it was real. 3 inspections in 2 years, not a single citation. I pulled out my file. I kept a file because the only person who was ever going to be organized on my behalf was me, and started calling. My city council contact, my attorney, the inspection office itself. By noon, I had a counter-complaint filed and a re-inspection scheduled. I did not call Weston. He found out anyway. Hector, the quieter of the 2 men who usually waited outside, knocked on my door the following morning and told me before Weston even came in. When Weston sat down, he looked at me for a long moment and asked if I knew what the citations were about. I told him I had a reasonable guess. He said a name. A developer named Harwick, who had been trying to acquire the block for 18 months, who had made 3 offers on my building, all refused by my landlord, who had recently become aware, apparently, that I was the reason a particular person visited a particular block in Greenpoint at 6 in the morning. I had become a pressure point. I told Weston the citations would not stick. He said Harwick would not stop at citations. I said I knew that, too. He looked at his oatmeal, then at me, and I could see him deciding something he had not yet put into words. I can make this stop, he said. Harwick backs down when he understands the math. But if I do that... Then he knows you care about this place, I said. About more than the place. The room got quiet enough that I could hear the oven cycling. I told him to eat his breakfast. He did. The escalation came fast after that, the way these things apparently do when the first soft move fails. My landlord called me on a Wednesday night, voice tight, telling me he had received an offer on the building, significantly above market, and his attorney was recommending he take it. He was sorry. He hoped I understood. I did not call Weston from the parking lot, where I stood for 20 minutes, in the November cold deciding what I felt. I called him from inside, sitting on my kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, because some news requires a wall behind you. He answered on the second ring. I told him what happened. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, I need you to trust me with something. I said that depended on what the something was. He told me he owned a building 4 blocks away. Ground floor, corner unit, empty since August. He wanted to offer me a 2-year lease with an option to buy at exactly my current rate, and have his attorney draw the paperwork before Friday. I told him I could not take that. He said I was not taking it. I was accepting the terms of a commercial lease from a landlord who needed a good tenant, and if those terms happened to be generous, it was because he made them, and he could make them however he wanted. I told him that sounded like a technicality, dressed up as a principle. He said yes, but the floor space was 1,600 square feet with a commercial kitchen already installed. And was I going to let a technicality stop me from finally having a proper ventilation hood? I laughed. It was not funny, but I laughed. I said I would think about it. He said he knew I would and that I should not think too long, because Harwick moved fast. I signed the lease on Thursday, my name, my terms. One condition I added myself and had Hector put in writing: no Ford Company signage, no mention of his name on anything connected to my business, no permanent cars out front. I was not going to be evidence of anything. I was not going to be anyone's known address. Hector read the addendum. looked up at me, and said he would make sure it was included. I moved in 2 weekends later. The kitchen was better than anything I had worked in outside the restaurant jobs, which I refused to be sentimental about. I arranged everything the way I wanted. Prep counter on the east wall, bread shelves near the window, the chalkboard menu exactly eye level when you came through the door. I chose the paint color myself, a warm off-white that did not try too hard. Weston came to see it before I opened. Just him and Hector early before anyone else. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, and then at me. And he did not say anything complimentary or sentimental, because I had learned by then that his compliments lived in the things he did not say, in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction when something was right. He said the bread shelf was going to collapse if I put more than 3 loaves on it. I told him it was a decorative shelf. He said it still looked unstable. I handed him a drill and a box of wall anchors and told him to fix it if it bothered him so much. He did. Without comment, Hector stood at the far end of the kitchen, pretending to check his phone and doing a very poor job of hiding that he was enjoying every second of it. The trouble with Harwick came to a head on a Saturday 3 weeks after I opened. I had a line out the door for the first time. A food writer had mentioned me in a newsletter. Regulars had brought friends, and I was managing the kind of rush that was exciting and exhausting in equal measure when the front window cracked. Not shattered. One clean fracture across the lower pane, the kind that said someone had hit it with something smaller than a rock, but bigger than an accident. My line went silent. I looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I told the woman at the front of the line her egg toast would be ready in 4 minutes, and I went back to my station. 2 hours later, after the rush, Hector was inside. He told me 2 of Harwick's people had been seen in the neighborhood that morning. He told me Weston wanted me to know. I asked if Weston was going to do something about it. Hector said that was up to me. I told him what I wanted done. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would leave evidence I would have to answer for. And Hector listened with the expression of a man who had heard considerably wilder requests and was grateful for the relative sanity of mine. He said he would pass it along. What happened to Harwick in the weeks after that, I was not fully told and did not fully ask. Certain city contracts he had been anticipating were quietly redirected. An old financial irregularity from a project 3 years prior was referred to an investigator. His offer on my former landlord's building was countered by a third party that nobody seemed able to trace to anything recognizable. By February, Harwick had relocated his main operations to another city. The morning I found that out, I made Weston a second bowl of oatmeal before he asked. He looked at it, and then at me, and something in his face changed in a way I was finally letting myself name. "We'll never got to try your food," he said. It came out of nowhere and landed so quietly that I stood there with a dish towel in my hand, not knowing where to put my eyes. Then I said, "Tell me what he liked." He looked up. "What kind of food he liked," I said. "I'll make it, not today, whenever you want." His jaw moved. He looked down at the bowl, and the thing about men who have learned to build walls out of stillness is that when one brick finally comes loose, you can see it happen if you are paying attention. "Scrambled eggs," he said. "Really good scrambled eggs with too much butter." He always said most people didn't use enough. He was right, I said. 3 weeks later, a Sunday, just the 2 of us before I opened, I made them. He sat at the counter, and I set the plate down, and he looked at it for a long time without moving. I went to wipe down the other end of the counter, not because it needed it, but because he needed me not to watch. He ate them all. He did not say anything for a while, neither did I. The oven ticked. The street outside was still Sunday quiet. Then he said my name, not in a way that demanded anything, in the way of a man who wanted to make sure someone was real. I turned around. He was looking at me the way he usually looked at things he needed to understand completely before he would allow himself to trust them. Only now, there was nothing calculating in it. Just attention, the whole weight of it, different from any way he had looked at me before. I crossed the kitchen and leaned against the counter beside him, close enough that our arms almost touched. I did not say anything. Some moments do not need explaining. He had spent 2 years unable to eat at a table someone else had set for him, and he had just finished a plate of his dead brother's favorite food in a room that belonged entirely to me, and either that meant something or it did not, and we both knew which one it was. After a while, he turned just enough to look at me directly. "I don't know what to call this," he said. "You don't have to call it anything," I said. He studied my face for a moment. "I'd rather call it something." "Then figure out what," I said. "You're not in a hurry." He almost smiled. "You never let me get away with anything." "No," I said, "that's why it works." His hand moved to cover mine on the counter. Not gripping, not pulling, just placing, with the deliberate care of a man who had learned that taking things too fast was how you broke them. I turned my palm up and let him hold it. He stayed until noon that day. I opened the shop and he sat at the end of the counter and drank 3 cups of coffee and read something on his phone, and I worked, and occasionally our eyes would meet across the room and neither of us would do anything about it, except look away first, and then not quite. Hector came in for a coffee at 10, observed the situation with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular development for approximately 6 weeks, and did his level best to act neutral about it. Mr. Petrakis came in for his usual at 9:15, looked at Weston at the end of the counter, looked at me, said, "Bread girl has good taste," and left. It was the nicest thing he had ever said to me, and I planned to remember it for a long time. That spring, I wrote Will's name on the inside of the bread shelf, the one Weston had anchored to the wall, in chalk, small enough that only someone going looking would find it. I did not tell him. He found it 6 weeks later, while helping me restock before the Saturday rush, and he went very still, with his hand on the shelf, and his back to me. Then he turned and looked at me across the kitchen. He came around the counter and put his arms around me, and I let him, both my hands in his coat, his chin against the top of my head, both of us quiet in the way of people who have learned the difference between silence that is empty and silence that is full. A year later, people would sometimes ask me how I knew it was real, and I always said the same thing. Because he kept showing up before 6 in the morning when he did not have to, and he learned the names of my regulars, and every Sunday without fail, he ate his brother's favorite eggs, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Because whatever had been broken in him had not been fixed. It had been kept company until it remembered it was not the whole story. And because the most guarded man I had ever known had given me the thing that cost him the most, which was not money, not protection, not the corner lease that kept Harwick from taking my door. It was simpler than all of that, and almost unbearably easy to miss if you were not paying attention. He had given me his hunger back. He had trusted me with it, and once a man like that trusts you with the thing that hurt him most, he does not take it back, does not pretend it never happened, does not look for a way to make it smaller. He stays at the end of the counter, he lets you fill his cup, and he calls the moment by its name.